You think she could even understand a single word of that? The voice was cold, clipped, almost mocking. Someone like her? Alexander Nakamura's sharp tone sliced through the air, echoing against the marble floor. No, I'd wager she doesn't even know what I'm saying. Just keep mopping. The maid froze mid-motion, her gloved hand tightening around the mop handle. Beneath her calm, lowered gaze, Amara Johnson felt something twist deep inside. Not anger, not pride, just the quiet ache of being unseen once again. She'd been cleaning the executive corridor since dawn, wiping down the same spotless floors of Nakamura Tower, a 20-story monument of glass and ego overlooking Central Park. The kind of place where people spoke in clipped tones and walked like they were afraid of leaving fingerprints. Alexander Nakamura, her boss, stood a few feet away, impeccably dressed in a black three-piece suit that looked like it cost more than her yearly pay. His hair, midnight black streaked with silver, fell in precise waves above sharp cheekbones. His Japanese mother's grace and his white father's severity had forged him into something statuesque. Cold beauty, molded in marble. He was on the phone, switching between English and Japanese seamlessly, negotiating something about shipments, deadlines, and unacceptable incompetence. His words weren't meant for her, but the sting still reached. Because he'd just used that phrase again. People like her. Amara bent to wring out the mop water, her movements slow and deliberate, her reflection rippling across the pristine tiles. He doesn't know, she thought. He doesn't know I understand every word. It wasn't the first time. Since she'd started here 3 months ago, Alexander had spoken freely in Japanese, assuming the maid with dark skin and southern accent couldn't possibly comprehend him. Sometimes he'd curse about his staff, other times about himself. Once she'd even heard him mutter in that same language, "Father was right." Americans don't understand discipline, but Amara did. She understood everything. Earlier that morning, she had walked the long corridor of the penthouse floor, where the smell of espresso and new leather always lingered. She moved silently, her worn shoes barely whispering against the marble. Every movement of her body, the way she tucked stray curls beneath her scarf, the soft sway of her shoulders as she carried her cleaning tray, spoke of a woman who wanted to disappear. But she hadn't always been this invisible. 5 years ago, Amara had been a language student in Tokyo. Living in a tiny apartment above a flower shop, she'd spoken fluent Japanese then, studied literature and music, and fallen in love with the sound of morning trains and the soft rhythm of rain against neon. Her professors had called her gifted. A bridge between cultures, they'd said. Then her mother got sick. The scholarship money ran out, and Amara came home, only to lose her mother, her dream, and the part of herself that once believed she belonged anywhere. Now she mopped floors for people who never looked her in the eye. At exactly 10:03 a.m., Alexander's voice boomed across the room. "Johnson." She straightened instantly, hands clasped. "Yes, sir." He didn't even look at her. "You missed a spot near the window." She turned toward the massive glass panes overlooking the city. They gleamed perfectly. There was no spot. Still, she nodded. "I'll fix it right away." When she bent to wipe the non-existent smudge, she caught his reflection in the glass. Broad shoulders, controlled posture, a face carved from frost. He wasn't cruel in the way men shout or sneer. He was cruel in the way he didn't see you at all. Then his phone rang again. He switched languages. Yes, Ms. Watanabe. Understood. She arrives tomorrow? Amara's breath caught Watanabe. The name sent a wave of memory washing through her. Cherry blossoms, laughter, and a woman in elegant heels teaching her how to pronounce R with a smile. Yuki Watanabe, her former professor, her mentor, the one person who'd believed in her gift for languages. Now she was coming here, to this tower, to this man, and Amara would have to serve tea to both of them. At noon, the staff kitchen buzzed with low chatter. The other maids whispered about Yuki's visit. "I heard she's from Tokyo," one said. "Real classy lady, not like the boss." "Bet he's trying to impress her," another joked, smirking. Amara kept quiet, stirring sugar into her coffee. She didn't tell them that she already knew Yuki, that the woman had once promised to write her a recommendation letter she never got to use. She didn't say that she'd once dreamed of working with people like Yuki. Not for them. Instead, she smiled faintly. He'll impress her. He always does. Later that evening, as the sunset bathed the office in gold, Amara was polishing the edge of a table when she overheard Alexander speaking with his assistant. "She's staying in the penthouse suite. Prepare everything. I want the staff flawless tomorrow. Especially the maid." His tone hardened. "I won't tolerate embarrassment in front of Ms. Watanabe. Understood?" "Yes, sir," the assistant murmured. Amara felt the heat rise to her cheeks. He wasn't speaking to her, yet the sting was personal. She'd be the one serving the tea, bowing low, invisible again. But somewhere beneath the ache of humiliation, something else flickered. An ember of quiet defiance. She had survived Tokyo. She had learned every nuance of that language, every unspoken code of humility and grace. And she'd been better at it than most of her classmates. Tomorrow, when Yuki Watanabe arrived, she'd see her old student again, though not in the way she ever imagined. That night, Amara walked home through the crowded city streets. Neon lights shimmered off puddles, echoing the reflections she once loved in Shinjuku. She clutched her small coat tighter, her mind replaying Alexander's voice, the way he'd said, "People like her." Under her breath, she whispered, in perfect Japanese, her words like silk against the night air, "People shouldn't be judged by appearances." The sound of it broke something open in her chest, the part of her that had stayed silent too long. Tomorrow, the woman who once taught her pride and poise would walk into the same building where she scrubbed floors. And for the first time, Amara wouldn't just be cleaning anymore. She'd be remembering who she was. "She used to be one of my best students," Yuki said softly, her eyes drifting toward the maid bent over a tray of porcelain cups. "But it seems life took her somewhere else." The words hung in the air like a delicate blade, polished, gentle, but sharp enough to cut. Alexander Nakamura's hand paused mid-air, hovering over his glass of whiskey. He turned toward his guest, his brow furrowing slightly. "You know her?" Yuki smiled faintly. "Amara Johnson. Yes, I taught her at Meiji University. Brilliant linguist. Fluent in Japanese by her second year." Alexander's silence stretched. The crackle of the fireplace filled the gap between them. He glanced toward Amara, who was kneeling by the coffee table, her back straight, her hands steady as she poured steaming green tea with perfect ceremony. The same ceremony his mother had drilled into him as a boy. Her movements were graceful, almost too graceful for a maid. He frowned, unsettled by a strange ripple of curiosity, a feeling he wasn't used to. That morning had begun with chaos. The tower buzzed in preparation for Yuki Watanabe's arrival. She was not just a business guest. She was a potential partner in a high-profile expansion into Japan. Someone whose endorsement could open or close billion-dollar doors. Alexander, who had built his empire on efficiency and dominance, wanted perfection. He barked orders, corrected flower arrangements, even replaced an entire tea set minutes before Yuki's arrival because the porcelain pattern didn't match the cultural aesthetic. When Amara entered the penthouse suite with her cleaning cart, the tension was palpable. "Johnson," Alexander snapped without looking at her. "Wipe every surface twice, then polish the piano keys. I want no fingerprints, no dust, not one." "Yes, sir," she murmured. He turned away, speaking to his assistant in rapid Japanese, unaware that Amara understood every biting word. American staff truly lack attention to detail, especially that maid. Her chest tightened. Still, she said nothing. At precisely 11:45 a.m., "C'est sa Frauen Fuan Frauen Pritz." Yuki Watanabe stepped out of the elevator. She was elegance personified. Tall, with shoulder-length raven hair and almond eyes that seemed to read people before they spoke. Her tailored ivory suit gleamed beneath the light, and the faint scent of jasmine followed her like a memory. "Alexander," she said warmly in Japanese, bowing slightly. "It's been a long time." He returned the bow stiffly. "Ms. Watanabe, welcome to New York." The conversation flowed easily between them, formal, precise, filled with polite laughter and subtle undertones of hierarchy. Amara watched from the corner, pretending to adjust cushions. Their words carried through the air like music she hadn't heard in years. When Yuki's gaze met hers, it softened. Recognition flickered, brief, but unmistakable. Amara lowered her head quickly, hoping it would pass. But it didn't. They were seated in the drawing room now. Amara knelt at the side table, pouring matcha into fine ceramic cups. Every motion was deliberate. The angle of the whisk, the small rotation before placing each cup down. Yuki watched her closely. Alexander followed her gaze. Finally, Yuki said, "You have an excellent maid. Her movements, they remind me of Japan." Alexander's lips curved faintly, his tone laced with pride and something else. Condescension. "She's diligent enough, but I wouldn't go that far." He leaned back, his cold gray eyes flicking to Amara. "Though it's rare to find one who doesn't break anything." Yuki's eyes narrowed, just slightly. "You should be careful, Alexander. You never know who's listening, or understanding." He gave a short laugh. "Oh, she doesn't understand a word of what we're saying. I assure you." The words landed heavy, and Amara's fingers froze mid-air. A drop of tea trembled at the lip of the cup before falling, plop, onto the saucer. Her pulse roared in her ears. She kept her face lowered, hiding the tremor in her hands. Yuki noticed. Her expression softened with pity, or perhaps disappointment. "I see," she murmured. Alexander shifted topics, talking about contracts and profits. But his words had already carved into the quiet space of the room, leaving an invisible bruise. Later, when Yuki stepped out for a call, Alexander remained seated, scrolling through his phone. Amara silently gathered the tea set, careful not to make a sound. But something compelled her to glance up, just once. And for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. He looked at her the way a man examines a painting he doesn't understand. Intrigued, but unwilling to admit it. There was something in her face, something controlled, yet proud. It unsettled him. "Johnson," he said suddenly, his voice quieter now. How long have you been working here? 3 months, sir. He nodded slowly. Do you like it? She hesitated. It pays the bills. He arched a brow. That's not an answer. I wasn't sure you wanted one, she said before she could stop herself. He blinked, surprised. A small flicker of amusement, or was it irritation, passed across his face. Careful, Miss Johnson. Sarcasm doesn't suit you. No, sir, she murmured, lowering her eyes again. Still, something had shifted in the air. Subtle. Dangerous. For the first time, she'd spoken back. And for the first time, Alexander Nakamura didn't know how to respond. That evening, after Yuki left, Alexander lingered in his office long after the others had gone. The city glittered below, a river of light and motion. He couldn't shake the image of Amara's hands, the calm precision in her movements, the shadow of emotion in her face when he'd spoken Japanese. Fluent by her second year, Yuki had said. He frowned, running a hand through his hair. It was absurd, impossible, a coincidence, and yet, downstairs, in the staff quarters, Amara sat on her narrow bed, staring at an old notebook. The pages were filled with neat Japanese script, kanji and hiragana she hadn't written in years. Her old Tokyo journal. She traced a line with her fingertip. Someday, I'll speak it again, not because I must, but because I can. Her eyes stung. Tomorrow, Alexander Nakamura would host a private dinner for Yuki and several investors from Japan. The staff would be expected to serve flawlessly, and Amara already knew it would be the night her silence would finally break. You think perfection can be bought? The voice was low, calm. But it didn't come from anyone Alexander expected. He turned, startled, as the words echoed faintly through the grand dining hall, only to see the maid, Amara, standing by the far wall, silver tray in hand, her gaze fixed on the floor. The guests hadn't arrived yet. The long oak table gleamed under crystal lights, set with porcelain plates and folded napkins like white origami. Yuki Watanabe was due any minute, along with 2 Japanese investors, powerful men Alexander needed on his side. Every detail had to be flawless. He frowned, adjusting his cufflinks. What did you say? Amara's pulse quickened. She hadn't meant for him to hear that. It had slipped out. A whisper, meant only for herself. Nothing, sir. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. There was something about her composure that unsettled him. The quiet steadiness that felt too knowing, too deliberate. Then, with a faint scoff, he dismissed it. Just make sure the tea service is flawless tonight. No mistakes. And if you can, try not to look so nervous. We're not on trial. Yes, sir. She turned away, but her hands were trembling. Not on trial, he said, yet that's exactly how it felt every day under his gaze. By 7 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. Yuki entered first, her smile gracious and poised. Beside her walked Mr. Takahiro Sato and Mr. Kenji Mori, 2 silver-haired executives from Tokyo, dressed in immaculately pressed suits. They bowed politely to Alexander, their conversation flowing in rapid Japanese. A beautiful evening, isn't it? Yes, Alexander replied, with mechanical precision. Let's make it a wonderful evening. Yuki smiled faintly. His accent was sharp, the kind of precision learned, not lived. She glanced at Amara, who stood silently by the table with her tray, eyes lowered. Please, Alexander gestured. Sit. Dinner will begin shortly. The first course was served. delicate bites of sushi flown in from a Michelin star chef. Amara moved gracefully between guests, pouring sake, clearing dishes. She felt the language washing over her, familiar, melodic, intimate. She caught fragments of the conversation: U.S. expansion, brand synergy, cultural adaptation. But underneath the politeness, she heard something colder. Kenji Mori leaned toward Yuki, lowering his voice. "You think he truly understands Japanese culture? Or is this another Western imitation?" Yuki hesitated. "He tries," she said quietly, "though perhaps he forgets that culture begins with humility." Alexander, busy checking his watch, didn't catch it. But Amara did. She couldn't help it. Her lips twitched faintly, a suppressed smile. For the first time, someone else had said what she'd always felt. But fate, cruelly punctual, never let moments like that pass quietly. Near the end of the second course, disaster struck. As Amara reached across the table to refill Yuki's cup, her sleeve brushed a glass of sake. It tipped, splashing clear liquid across the linen and narrowly missing Alexander's hand. The room froze. Yuki's eyes widened in mild concern. The Japanese executives murmured softly, embarrassed on her behalf. Alexander's jaw tightened. He stood slowly, napkin in hand. "Johnson," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Look at me." Amara's breath caught. "I'm sorry, sir." "Do you realize," he interrupted sharply, "how many eyes are on us right now? How hard it is to find staff who can follow simple instructions?" Her cheeks burned. The humiliation pressed down like a weight. "It was an accident, sir." I don't care if it was an accident." He stepped closer, his voice a hiss now. "Do you think accidents belong in this room? These people built their lives on discipline, precision, something you might not understand." The words were a blade, cutting through the last fragile wall of her silence. Yuki opened her mouth to speak, but Amara bowed deeply, holding her composure. "My apologies, Mr. Nakamura. Clean it up. Then stay out of sight," he snapped. The guests looked away politely, pretending not to witness the scene. But the air had shifted, heavy, awkward, filled with something sharp and sour. Amara knelt, dabbing at the linen with steady hands. The floor's reflection shimmered with her tears, though she refused to let them fall. In her mind, Japanese words echoed, the ones he'd thrown carelessly days ago. People like her wouldn't last a day in Tokyo. She had lasted 5 years, and tonight she would remind him of it. The rest of the dinner unfolded like a dream, or a nightmare, depending on where you stood. The guests laughed politely. Yuki steered the conversation away from the awkward moment, and Alexander resumed his polished composure. But behind him, Amara stood by the door, hands clasped, eyes burning with resolve. She couldn't let this end like every other humiliation. Not this time. When the dessert was served and the investors began speaking in Japanese about finalizing the deal, Alexander's translator, a young man named Ryan, suddenly approached in a panic. "Sir," he whispered, "the interpreter you requested. She's stuck in traffic. She won't make it in time." Alexander froze. The investors had already begun asking questions, technical, cultural, layered with nuance. Yuki looked uneasy. "Sir," Ryan said again, voice trembling, "they're waiting for you to respond." Alexander swallowed hard, forcing a calm smile. "Of course," he said in English. Just a moment. Then, before he could speak again, a soft voice broke the silence. "Excuse me. If you'd allow me, I can translate." Every head turned. It was the maid. Amara stood straight now, her posture elegant, her voice clear and melodic. Her Japanese rolled from her tongue like music, flawless, natural, alive. The silence that followed was electric. Yuki's lips parted in stunned recognition. The investors exchanged astonished glances, and Alexander, the man who had just humiliated her minutes ago, stood frozen, eyes wide, his world shattering quietly behind them. You can speak it? Amara met his gaze at last, steady and unflinching. Yes, I lived in Tokyo for 5 years. The silence deepened. Remarkable, perfect pronunciation. And just like that, the room's attention shifted, from the billionaire who demanded perfection to the maid who already embodied it. Alexander could only stare, breath caught, as his entire hierarchy cracked before his eyes. "She's perfect," murmured Yuki Watanabe softly. "Absolutely flawless." The boardroom, elegantly set for the final signing dinner, was dead silent. All eyes were on Amara Johnson, who now stood at the head of the long table, shoulders square, chin raised slightly, poised in a way that made her seem taller than she was. The meek maid from hours ago had vanished. Her soft brown skin seemed to glow beneath the amber light, and the faint tremor that once lived in her hands was gone. She was confident, composed, radiant, the kind of grace that could only come from years of knowing and surviving another world. And she was speaking fluent, articulate Japanese. For the first time in her life, she wasn't cleaning up someone else's mess. She was saving the entire room from collapsing into it. The moment she began interpreting, everything shifted. Her words were smooth, her tone precise, her comprehension sharp as crystal. She didn't just translate, she conveyed meaning. She read every facial cue, softened every sharp tone, and gave the Japanese executives the kind of respectful nuance that even Alexander's hired interpreters had never managed. Yuki sat still, half smiling with restrained pride. The two investors, Sato and Mori, nodded often, clearly impressed. They murmured to one another about her elegance, her cadence, her understanding of keigo, the polite form that even natives sometimes stumbled over. And across the table, Alexander Nakamura, ruthless billionaire, self-proclaimed perfectionist, sat in quiet disbelief. He couldn't take his eyes off her. For years, Alexander had believed that strength meant control, that refinement was a privilege earned by power. But watching Amara, he saw something he hadn't known existed. Quiet mastery, built not on wealth or status, but on perseverance. He remembered every cruel thing he had said, every careless word of Japanese he had uttered in her presence, believing she couldn't understand. And now she was speaking that same language with more grace than he ever had. As she interpreted the contract discussion, one of the executives, Mr. Sato, smiled warmly at her. "You are an extraordinary interpreter." Amara bowed slightly, her voice gentle. "Thank you very much." Then Sato turned to Alexander. "Mr. Nakamura, you have an exceptional employee. She understands not just language, but respect." The compliment hit him like a slow burn. Exceptional. Employee. He had dismissed her as invisible. Now his investors were admiring her. Yuki leaned back, her eyes glimmering. "I did tell you she was gifted," she said quietly, almost teasing. Alexander forced a smile, but his throat was tight. You did, he said, voice low. I had no idea. Amara glanced toward him then, just once. Her gaze was calm, unreadable. But in that single look, he saw everything. Her hurt, her pride, her restraint. She wasn't angry. She didn't need to be. Her brilliance was punishment enough. When the meeting ended, the investors stood and bowed. The deal had gone flawlessly, better than expected. They left the room full of praise for Amara, calling her the heart of the evening. Yuki approached her quietly. Amara, she said softly, switching to English. I wondered if it was really you. You always had the gift. Amara smiled faintly. You taught me everything I know. No, Yuki corrected gently. I taught you the words. Life taught you the meaning. Their eyes met. A small, quiet reunion between teacher and student, filled with unspoken history. Then Yuki's gaze shifted toward Alexander, who stood at the far end of the room, still frozen by the shock of his own humility. You should talk to him, she murmured. He needs to hear it. Amara's smile faded. I don't think he's ready. Then let him learn what it feels like to wait. Later that night, the hall was empty. The lights dimmed. The city glittered through the tower's glass walls like scattered fireflies. Alexander sat alone at the table, staring at his reflection in the untouched glass of whiskey. His mind replayed the evening over and over. Her voice, her posture, the flawless rhythm of her speech. And the moment when everyone in that room, everyone, had looked at her with respect. Something inside him cracked. Not his ego. That had shattered long ago. What broke was the wall that had kept him from seeing. He rose slowly, walked out into the corridor and found her near the service elevator, folding her cleaning cloths neatly. Amara, he said quietly. She turned, her eyes steady but cautious. Yes, Mr. Nakamura. He swallowed, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Why didn't you tell me? She blinked, then gave a small, almost bitter laugh. Would it have mattered? His jaw tensed. I might have treated you differently. That's exactly why I didn't, she said. Her voice didn't rise, didn't shake. It was calm, the kind of calm that comes only from surviving humiliation. I didn't need your approval, she continued. I just needed this job. And the silence was easier than trying to prove I belonged. Alexander looked at her. Really looked, maybe for the first time. The delicate curve of her face, the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet strength in the way she stood tall despite everything. I was cruel, he admitted softly, and ignorant. Yes, she said without hesitation. The honesty hit him like a blow, but he didn't turn away. Instead, he nodded slowly, the sharpness of his arrogance finally blunted by truth. He exhaled shakily. You saved me tonight. You saved this company, she shook her head. No, Mr. Nakamura, I saved myself. A silence stretched between them. Heavy, human, unguarded. Finally, he bowed. Deeply. Properly. The way one bows in apology in Japan. Both hands at his sides, eyes down. Thank you, he said in Japanese, voice trembling. Truly, I am sorry. Amara froze, her breath catching. The humility in his tone was real, raw and unpolished. Slowly, she bowed back. She whispered, I forgive you. For the first time since she'd arrived in New York, Amara felt her heart ease. Alexander straightened, his expression soft. No longer the ruthless man of marble, but someone almost human beneath the glass. "Good night, Amara," he said quietly. She nodded. "Good night, Mr. Nakamura." As he walked away, she closed her eyes. The air felt lighter, like the end of a long storm. But she knew it wasn't over yet. Tomorrow, the story would spread through the company. The staff, the press, the investors, everyone would know what happened. And Alexander Nakamura would face a mirror bigger than any glass wall in his tower. Next morning broke over Manhattan with its usual sharp gold, light spilling through the glass. Facade of Nakamura Holdings like a stage spotlight. But inside, the air was different. It buzzed with whispers. Amara could feel it before she even reached the main floor. The sideways glances, the sudden hushes whenever she passed. The way people stared not with disdain, but disbelief. She was no longer invisible. Word had spread like wildfire. The maid who spoke fluent Japanese. The maid who saved the deal. The maid who made the CEO bow. By the time Amara reached the janitor's closet, she could hear fragments of conversation echoing down the corridor. "Did you hear? Mr. Nakamura actually apologized, in Japanese. To her? Yup, in front of Yuki Watanabe and everyone. No way." She stood silently in the doorway, clutching her cleaning gloves, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Across the building, in the top-floor office where the city stretched beneath him like an empire of glass, Alexander Nakamura sat behind his desk. But the man in the mirror wasn't the one who'd looked back yesterday. He'd barely slept. The scene replayed in his mind. The way she'd looked at him, not with fear or anger, but with something far worse. Disappointment. He'd spent years crushing men twice his size in negotiation rooms, building a reputation for being untouchable. And yet, one quiet maid, with a soft voice and flawless Japanese, had dismantled his arrogance in less than an hour. He'd bowed, and for the first time, it had meant something. He glanced at the company email notifications stacking up. The investors had already sent their thanks. So had Yuki, but there was one email that stood out. From his PR director. "We've had inquiries about the Japanese-speaking maid who saved the Nakamura-Sato deal. Some media outlets want to profile her. Should we issue a statement?" Alexander stared at the screen. Then he stood. Downstairs, Amara was refilling her mop bucket when she heard the familiar click of dress shoes behind her. "Miss Johnson," came the deep voice. She turned, startled. Alexander stood in the doorway, in a tailored charcoal suit, his expression unreadable, but his posture oddly gentle. "Good morning, Mr. Nakamura," she said quickly, lowering her eyes. He stepped forward, folding his hands behind his back. "You don't have to call me that today," she blinked. "Sir?" he exhaled, as if steadying himself. "You'll be joining me upstairs," she frowned. "For what?" He gave a small, rueful smile. "For the recognition you deserve. Within an hour." The staff cafeteria, usually buzzing with idle chatter, became a silent hall of eyes. Alexander stood at the front with a microphone, his voice steady but softer than anyone had ever heard. "Yesterday," he began, "a deal that this company has pursued for 3 years was saved. Not by an executive. Not by a board member, not by me." A pause. He glanced at Amara, who stood quietly at the edge of the stage, hands clasped in front of her, her uniform pressed but plain. "It was saved," he continued, "by someone most of us overlooked. Someone whose humility hid a brilliance we never took the time to see." The crowd stirred. Whispered recognition spread. people began realizing who he was talking about. He gestured toward her. "Miss Amara Johnson." A wave of gasps rolled through the crowd. Amara's heart pounded in her chest. Alexander turned to her, his voice lowering. "You spoke Japanese with honor and heart. Not for reward, not for recognition, but because it was right. And for that, I owe you not only gratitude, but an apology." He bowed deeply. Gasps again. No one in that building, not one person, had ever seen Alexander Nakamura bow to anyone. But he stayed down for a long moment, and when he rose, his voice broke slightly. "I have been many things. Successful, feared, efficient, but not decent. And you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That respect is not given by power. It's earned by grace." The silence that followed was electric. Then came the applause. Slow, uncertain at first, then growing into a thunderous wave. Amara stood frozen, tears forming but refusing to fall. She bowed back, low, humble, sincere. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling. "But I didn't do it to prove anything. I just wanted to do something good, before leaving." Alexander frowned, confusion flickering. "Leaving?" She nodded slowly. "I was planning to quit this week. I didn't think there was a place for me here." The admission hit him harder than expected. For a second, he forgot how to breathe. "Please," he said softly, almost pleading. "Don't." Her eyes lifted, surprised. "I can't undo how I treated you," he continued, "but I can make sure you're never invisible again." He turned toward the crowd, voice firm. "Effective immediately, Amara Johnson will be transferred to the International Relations Department as a cultural liaison, with a full scholarship toward her language certification, sponsored by me." The room erupted, gasps, cheers, clapping, all mixed into a flood of astonishment. Amara covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now. "Mr. Nakamura, I can't accept—" "Yes, you can," he interrupted softly, "because you've earned it. Every word, every second of grace you gave me, you've earned this 1,000 times over." The applause swelled again. Yuki stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, eyes glistening with pride. And for the first time, Amara didn't shrink from the noise. She stood tall, radiant and trembling, as the world that once ignored her finally saw her. Alexander turned to her again, a faint smile crossing his usually stoic face. "You're remarkable, Miss Johnson. You should know that." She wiped her tears, smiling shakily. "And you're learning." He laughed, the sound of a man who hadn't laughed in years. "Touché," he said softly. Later, when the hall emptied and silence returned, he found her again by the window overlooking the skyline. The city shimmered below them. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "The position is yours. So is my apology, for as long as it takes to make it right." She smiled faintly. "Apologies don't need time, Mr. Nakamura. They need change." He nodded, eyes glinting. "Then I'll start there." As the elevator doors closed behind him, Amara watched his reflection vanish into the mirrored walls. And for the first time in years, she believed that even the coldest people could thaw. She had walked into that tower invisible. Now she walked out seen, not for what she did, but for who she was. And somewhere deep inside her, The quiet girl who had once swept floors and swallowed pain whispered, "You did it." The sun dipped behind the skyline like an ember sinking into smoke, staining the windows of Nakamura Tower in hues of gold and rose. The day after Amara's public recognition felt strangely still, as though the whole building was holding its breath. People greeted her differently now. The same executives who once brushed past her now smiled, held doors, asked how she was doing, some with genuine warmth, others out of guilt. But none of that mattered. She had spent so long surviving silence that she didn't need their noise to feel seen. When Amara arrived on the 34th floor for her first day as cultural liaison, the staff paused mid-conversation. She wore a soft ivory blouse tucked neatly into a charcoal skirt, her curls pinned back, her eyes calm but sharp. Her badge no longer read custodial staff. It read international relations. Her small cubicle overlooked the Hudson River, a window view she'd once polished, never thought she'd sit behind. There was a bouquet waiting on her desk, a single white lily in the center, a note written in clean handwriting. For courage that spoke louder than pride. A.N. Amara smiled softly, touching the flower. Then she got to work. The following week brought a rush of interviews and articles. Photos of her bowing beside Alexander flooded the news cycle. CEO humbled by Maid's genius. The polyglot Cinderella of Wall Street. But she declined every media request. She wasn't interested in fame, only in peace. Still, the whispers persisted, from boardrooms to coffee breaks. She was cleaning floors a week ago. Now she's advising the CEO. Guess miracles happen when you speak Japanese. Amara ignored them all. She knew gossip was just awe in disguise. Alexander, meanwhile, was changing, slowly but visibly. The man who once barked orders now paused before speaking. He listened more. He thanked people by name. And though his power and presence still filled every room, there was a softness around the edges, as if he was trying to rebuild himself from the inside out. Yuki Watanabe noticed it during their next meeting. "You're different," she said, sipping her tea. Alexander smiled faintly. "You mean less unbearable?" "Exactly," she replied, amused. "Amara taught you well." He looked down, thoughtful. "She didn't teach me. She reminded me." One evening, Amara was leaving late when she found Alexander alone in the conference room. The skyline burned orange behind him. "Working late again?" she asked gently. He looked up, surprised, then smiled. "Habit. You?" "I was reviewing our Japanese correspondence. Your grammar's improving." He chuckled softly. "Only because my teacher keeps correcting me in red ink." Amara raised an eyebrow. "You mean my notes?" "Exactly." Their laughter softened the space between them, a rare human moment amid glass and marble. Then his expression shifted. "Amara, may I ask you something?" She nodded. "Why Japan? Why learn the language?" Her gaze drifted toward the window. "Because once, when I was 19, I heard a pianist in Tokyo Station. I didn't understand a word of what he was saying between songs, but I understood how it felt. I promised myself I'd learn to understand everything that beautiful." Alexander studied her for a long moment. And now you do. Not everything, she said with a small smile. But enough. He hesitated, then said quietly, You could teach me. Not just words, but what they mean. Amara met his eyes. I think life already started doing that for you. The next day, something unexpected happened. The janitorial team, her old colleagues, approached her in the lobby. There were 4 of them, wearing navy uniforms, eyes bright with pride. Miss Amara, said Mrs. Hughes, the oldest of them, voice trembling slightly. We just wanted to say thank you. You showed them we're more than what they see. Amara smiled softly, tears forming. We always were. They hugged her, tightly, and for the first time since this began, she felt the warmth of something deeper than victory. Vindication. Later that afternoon, Alexander called her into his office. When she entered, he was standing by the window, holding 2 passports, one blue, one black. Are those? He nodded. We're expanding to Osaka next quarter. I want you to lead the first cultural team on the ground. Amara's breath caught. Me? Who better? He said simply. You understand both worlds. You bridge them without trying. That's exactly what we need. She hesitated. That's a lot of responsibility. He smiled faintly. Then it's about time someone gave it to you. That night, Amara walked home through the cool November air, the city lights flickering like paper lanterns above her. She thought about everything that had changed, and everything that hadn't. The same streets, the same sky, the same soft hum of New York life. But she was walking taller now, freer. She whispered softly to herself in Japanese, words she had once only dreamed of saying with confidence. I am seen. I am known. And for the first time, she believed it. Meanwhile, Alexander stood in his empty office, looking at the same skyline from higher up. But for once, it didn't make him feel above anyone. It made him feel small, grateful. He thought of the maid who had taught him humility, the woman who'd shown him the beauty in silence, and the rare miracle of being truly understood. He whispered her name, barely audible, like a prayer he didn't know how to say. Amara. The city glowed beneath him, alive with the promise of second chances. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he'd face it differently. Because a quiet woman, with gentle hands and unshakable grace, had shown him what strength really looked like. And he would never forget her for as long as he lived. The plane descended over a quilt of green hills and soft rivers, and as the announcement came in both Japanese and English, Amara's heart thrummed with quiet disbelief. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Osaka. It was her first time in Japan, the country she had studied, dreamed about, spoken of in secret to herself for years while mopping marble floors. Now she wasn't anyone's maid. She was here as a delegate, the head of cultural relations for Nakamura Holdings' new expansion. She pressed her palm against the window, watching the skyline glimmer beneath the morning light. This is real, she thought. At the airport terminal, a familiar voice greeted her. Yukoso, Amara-san. Welcome, Miss Amara. She turned, and there was Yuki Watanabe, smiling warmly, holding a small bouquet of white camellias. Yuki-sensei, Amara exclaimed. eyes filling. They embraced, laughter spilling through the air. "I told you we would meet again," Yuki said, pulling back. "And not as teacher and student, but as equals." Amara smiled, her throat tightening. "You've always been my sensei." Then your sensei is proud beyond words. The Osaka branch opening was a grand affair. Press cameras flashed, executives lined the marble stage, and Japanese investors filled the hall. But in the center of it all stood Amara, in a cream silk blouse and navy skirt, her braids pinned neatly, her poise effortless. Alexander was beside her, sharp as ever in a midnight suit. But there was something unrecognizably humble in his posture now. His icy composure had melted into something warm, quietly respectful. When it was her turn to speak, Amara stepped forward. The microphone caught her soft breath before she began. In Japanese. "It is an honor to return to this beautiful country. Once I lived in silence as a maid. But words have the power to transform people." The audience stilled, mesmerized by her fluency, but even more by her sincerity. She continued, alternating between Japanese and English. "Every culture has its own kind of silence, sometimes humility, sometimes invisibility. But the miracle happens when silence meets understanding." Her eyes flicked briefly to Alexander, who watched her like someone seeing light through stained glass. "This company stands here today because we learned to listen, not only to languages, but to people. And that lesson began with respect." Applause thundered through the hall. When she stepped back, Alexander leaned toward her and whispered, "You stole the entire room." She smiled faintly. "I didn't steal it. I just spoke." Later that night, after the celebration dinner, Amara found herself standing on the terrace overlooking Osaka Bay. The lights shimmered on the water, 1,000 stars mirrored below. Alexander joined her quietly. "I keep thinking," he said, "if I hadn't heard you speak that day." She turned to him, smiling. "You would have missed a lesson you needed." He chuckled softly. "That's true." They stood in silence for a moment, the breeze carrying the scent of salt and spring. Then, without warning, his voice grew quieter. "I used to think I knew what power was, control, money, reputation. But then you walked into my office and made me see how small all of that was." Amara looked at him, her eyes warm. "Sometimes the biggest voices are the quietest ones." He nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting. "You taught me that too." A bell rang from the harbor below, a ferry departing, cutting through the silver reflection of moonlight. Amara closed her eyes, breathing it all in. The hum of Japan, the warmth of the air, the steady rhythm of a life she had once only dared to imagine. When she opened them again, Alexander was watching her. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said suddenly, voice low. "You already have it," she replied simply. He swallowed, looking down. "Then maybe one day I can earn your friendship too." She smiled softly. "You already have that, Mr. Nakamura." Weeks passed. Under Amara's guidance, the Osaka branch flourished, bridging cultures, building trust, opening doors that had been sealed by arrogance before. And each time Alexander visited, he deferred to her insights, listened when she spoke, and bowed when she entered the room. Small gestures that rippled louder than any apology. Their relationship grew into something deeper. Not romance, not exactly, but something profoundly human. Two souls who had seen each other at their most broken, and somehow brought one another back to wholeness. One evening, as Amara prepared to leave for home, she received a message on her phone. "You once said life teaches meaning. Thank you for being my greatest teacher. A.N." She smiled, shaking her head, and whispered softly, "And you were mine." When her flight took off that night, she looked down at the glowing sprawl of Osaka and whispered in Japanese, "Goodbye, but not forever." Because she knew this wasn't the end. It was the quiet, shining beginning of something new. A story no one would ever think began with a mop and a bucket. Epilogue months later, back in New York, a framed article hung in the Nakamura Holdings lobby. "The Maid Who Spoke Japanese" and "Changed a Billionaire." Beneath it was a small brass plaque, engraved with her favorite quote, "Respect is the language everyone understands." Amara Johnson visitors stopped to read it every day, and sometimes, when the evening sun hit the brass just right, it gleamed, soft and gold, like the quiet kind of miracle that changes a life forever.